The desert at El Alamein was a furnace of stone, dust, and heat, a narrow gateway between the Axis armies and the Nile. In the summer of 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had driven the British Eighth Army back across hundreds of miles of North African desert. His armored columns had chased them relentlessly toward Egypt and the lifeline of the Suez Canal, threatening to cut the British Empire in two and choke off vital oil supplies. Yet at El Alamein, the geography itself shifted the balance. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, the impassable Qattara Depression. There would be no wide flanking maneuvers here. The desert forced both armies into a direct collision, a trial by fire with no way around. The first clash had already checked Rommel's seemingly unstoppable momentum. His Afrika Corps, starved of fuel and supplies, battered by exhaustion, and denied reinforcements, slammed into British defenses hastily thrown together and, for the first time, found them holding firm. The British, bruised but learning quickly, steadied themselves. Reinforcements poured in from across the empire. Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, South Africans, Free French, and others gathered under the banner of the Eighth Army. New commanders emerged and fresh machines, the sturdy Sherman tanks and self-propelled guns, began to tip the balance. By autumn of 1942, General Bernard Montgomery had replaced wavering leadership with methodical discipline. He believed the time for desperate holding actions was over. His plan was designed not for elegance, but for certainty, to pulverize the Axis line with overwhelming artillery, breach its lethal minefields, the so-called Devil S Gardens, and roll wave after wave of armor through the gaps until momentum broke the stalemate. It would not be a battle won in hours, but in attrition, one deliberate blow after another, until even Rommel could no longer hold. Preparation became ritual. At night, sappers crept forward under the cold desert stars, probing for mines with bayonets, their hands trembling as steel tapped against buried death. They marked safe paths with white tape, thin lines of salvation across a sea of explosives. Above them, deception unfolded. Dummy tanks constructed from canvas and wood misled Axis observers, while feint operations drew their gaze elsewhere. In wireless huts, Allied codebreakers used ultra-intercepts to drain Rommel's secrets from the air. Knowledge became a weapon as vital as any gun. Behind the lines, the desert hummed with nervous energy. Mechanics worked by lantern light, replacing worn treads, patching engines, tightening bolts with sand crusted into every groove. Pilots studied maps smudged with dust, knowing that once battle began, the sky would be as lethal as the ground. Chaplains walked among the troops, offering words that barely carried over the sound of distant guns. Men wrote last letters home, paper smudged with grit, sealed with sweat. The smell of oil and cordite already clung to the air. Then, on the night of October 23, 1942, the horizon exploded. The opening barrage was not a volley, but a storm of steel. Over 1,000 artillery pieces roared in unison, their shells tearing the night into a constant drum roll. The ground shook as though the desert itself were breaking apart. Men shouted without hearing their own voices. The air vibrated in their lungs. To the Axis troops dug into their lines, it was as if the sky itself had turned against them. Beneath this thunder, Allied infantry began their advance. Through smoke and fire, they unspooled white tape across the minefields, each step a gamble with death. Machine guns scythed down men who rose too high, mortars rained steel fragments into the darkness, and stretcher bearers crawled through blood and sand to drag the wounded back. Operation Lightfoot, Montgomery called it, because men, not tanks, would first clear the minefields. A soldier's body weighed less than a machine, and in this cruel arithmetic, lives bought space for armor. At dawn, the tanks began to move. Grinding forward into narrow, mine-cleared lanes, they advanced like ships navigating reefs, hemmed in on all sides by hidden threats. The desert became an arena of fire. British Shermans and Crusaders pushing against dug-in German panzers, anti-tank guns spitting fire from camouflaged pits. Every advance was paid in burning metal and dying crews. Flames leapt from wrecks. Hatches glowed red-hot as men inside screamed for air that never came. Rommel counterpunched with what strength remained. He fed reserves into the firestorm, where black smoke rose from burning oil drums and the sand was slick with spilled fuel. His men, exhausted and undersupplied, fought with grim determination, using every advantage of terrain and concealment. The battle settled into a merciless rhythm. Breach, block, reinforce, strike, recoil, strike again. Each day consumed more lives, more shells, more fuel. The desert itself seemed to thirst for blood. Curiosities and ironies of desert warfare surfaced amid the carnage. Long-range desert group scouts slipped like ghosts behind enemy lines, steering by the stars, their notebooks gritty with sand. Mechanics rebuilt entire engines under moonlight with scarves pulled across their faces, spitting grit from their teeth. Water discipline was absolute law, every sip measured, every drop contested. Soldiers wrote letters home that returned smudged with dust, carrying the taste of the desert across oceans. When the wind shifted at dawn, the smell of cordite carried for miles, and in the pale light, men discovered graveyards of twisted tanks, where the night before there had been only barren scrub. For days, the front seemed immovable. Each attack clawed forward a few hundred yards before withering under fire. Yet each hour drained Axis reserves, fuel convoys cut off, spare parts impossible to replace, troops stretched thin and weary, tires shredded, suspensions failed, and tank hulls sank deeper into the sand. Montgomery, patient as a tide, shifted his weight across the line, preparing the decisive strike. He knew Rommel could not replace his losses. That decisive blow came with Operation Supercharge. Before sunrise, fresh brigades surged through cleared mine lanes, artillery pounding a path before them with unrelenting precision. The objective was simple in concept and murderous in practice. Smash a hole wide enough for armored divisions to pour through and then keep pushing until the entire Axis position collapsed. The desert erupted in tank duels at point-blank range. Shermans and Grants fired so close their crews could see enemy faces framed in periscopes before pulling the trigger. Steel clashed against steel, and the battlefield lit up with the flashes of guns and the glare of burning fuel. Rommel, recently returned from illness, surveyed a battlefield on the brink of ruin. He hurled in his last mobile reserves, veterans who had once seemed unstoppable across North Africa. But now their tanks sputtered, Bowsers ran dry, and anti-tank guns barked only once before falling silent for lack of shells. The Afrika Korps, long admired as the masters of maneuver, found itself pinned helplessly in place. When the British armored thrust broke through, the Axis line did not bend back into shape. It tore apart completely. Retreat became the only logic left. Axis convoys streamed westward, engines straining, harried by Allied aircraft that now dominated the skies. The desert roads filled with black smoke as depots were torched in haste, denying supplies to the pursuers. Along the routes lay the wrecks of panzers abandoned mid-repair, their toolkits scattered, hatches open like gaping wounds. Crews had fought to squeeze one more mile from engines already dead, then fled when the fuel finally ran dry. For the men of the 8th Army, the sight was vindication. They had not merely checked Rommel, they had broken him. For the first time in the long desert war, momentum shifted decisively to the Allies. A statesman would later remark that before El Alamein, there had been no real Allied victories, and afterward, no true defeats. Hyperbole or not, the essence was undeniable. The desert had turned, and with it, the war. Yet the cost was etched in blood and fire. The desert floor was littered with the debris of war, burned-out vehicles, blasted helmets, boots abandoned by men who would never wear them again. In the dressing stations, surgeons worked without rest, their hands raw, their gowns soaked. Wounded men muttered deliriously about the barrage, about the minefields, about comrades lost in the smoke. In Cairo and Alexandria, as news of victory spread, restaurants lit lamps for the first time in months, music spilling back into the streets. Families whispered hope again. In barracks, soldiers who had survived allowed themselves a breath, a cigarette, a laugh too sharp to last. For across the sea, New storms already gathered. Operation Torch landings in North Africa, the tightening of a vice that would crush the axis between two fronts. And yet for those who had endured El Alamein, memory remained simple and terrible. They would forever recall the thunder of 1,000 guns rolling across the desert night, the fragile white tape stretched across minefields like lifelines in the dark, the smell of oil and blood mixing with the wind, and the endless, merciless push until at last, the line broke. El Alamein was more than victory. It was a crucible where men broke and still fought on. Shattered bodies crawled through smoke and fire, refusing to yield. In that furnace of despair, courage was measured not in triumph, but in the will to take one more step. The desert had tested them to the limit, and in the end, it was here, on this scorched, narrow strip of Egypt, that the tide of the Second World War first began to turn.